Andy, for many of us, the question, what is consciousness, is the defining question about the nature of reality. And maybe other than theoretical physicists, it is the question that is most probative of the nature of reality, certainly our reality, many approaches to it. You have been one of the pioneers of the concept of embodied mind and embodied cognition, that the body is critical for this. And could this help us understand what consciousness is?
Yeah, I think it can. Consciousness is a very elusive topic. Different people do seem to mean slightly different things, and I think one of the big divides in the field here is between people that think that there's a hard problem of consciousness and people that don't. So I should probably admit at the outset that I don't think there is a hard problem of consciousness. I think there are a lot of easy problems. The hard problem, as you know, was supposed to be how can we get across the big gap that exists between physical stuff doing what it does and there being a mental life at all. I tend to be a deflationist about that. I think that if we could explain why it is that we say and do all the things we say and do, including those things we say and do that express our puzzlement about our own conscious experiences and so on, then we would have solved the problem, because at that point we would know that if we built a robot like that, it would behave like us, it would talk to us, it would be puzzled about the nature of its own qualitative, or at least it would, not to beg the question, it would appear to be puzzled about the nature of its own qualitative experiences. So I'm going to take a deflationist approach, and once I've sort of made a start in that direction, then one place to immediately look, I think, is in the role of interoceptive information in the construction of my moment-by-moment take on the world. So this is where I think embodied cognition and work on the predictive brain get to come together to tell us something that might be important about consciousness. The way that I think that might work is that interoceptive information about the gut, the viscera, the actions that I'm currently preparing, gets to sort of colour all of my perceptual take on the world. So the way the world is given to me in perception is coloured by what I'm ready to do, coloured by whether I'm hungry, thirsty, and so on. And that sort of colouring, which you can see in predictive brain stories, where you're using that information to help predict the sensory input, I think is part of what it is to be a creature for whom some things matter and some things don't, and what matters varies according to your bodily state. This, I think, is creeping up on consciousness. There are other layers to consciousness, like self-awareness and heavy-duty self-awareness, and we could talk about those too.
Certainly, the vast majority of humanity and many intellectuals over the centuries have discussed and thought about consciousness as being able to exist without a body. Certainly, the whole religious tradition of souls and stuff, psychic traditions, Eastern religions, all different ways have imagined a consciousness that can be independent of a body. So from your perspective, though, I would think that as a thought question, because I'm sure you think that would be impossible, but if it were possible to have a consciousness without a body, I think you would want to say that consciousness would be a very different kind of consciousness than what we currently have.
Yes, that's right. So as a good embodied cognition theorist, I think the kind of body you have makes a big difference to the way that you experience the world. Therefore, it makes a big difference to the contents of your consciousness. If you were a spider consciousness, you would have very different kinds of contents to the ones that you have as a human consciousness. At the same time, I think that we are very, very flexible creatures. And because of the enormous amount of kind of neural plasticity that we have, I don't see any barrier to kind of future worlds in which something that is recognizable as my consciousness gets to control very different kinds of bodies. So my sort of embodiment adherence here is kind of provisional in one way. I think embodiment is essential but always negotiable. That's to say, it could still be me, but control a very different kind of body, even though it wouldn't be me in quite the sort of disembodied kind of way.
But to create the me in the first place,
Yeah.
it was very much tied to the body that you
Yeah.
currently have.
Exactly. I think all of that learning, I think the learning that instills a rich grip on how the world is learning about how to move around and change your own sensory flows so as to bring new ones about. This is how we bring the world into view. You see this in those old TVSS experiments, tactile visual sensory substitution, where they gave people little sort of pads, that, blind people, pads that brought in visual information that was transmitted through tactile sensors. And in order to begin to use that information properly, people had to be able to move their own cameras around, move the sensory system around, create these sort of dynamic interminglings between what's coming in at the peripheries and what you're doing. I think that's what it is to understand the world. So embodiment is super crucial for learning. Yeah.
And so the embodiment creates the kind of mentality or the kind of consciousness that you have, which you want to deflate currently, and if that could be somehow used in the future, that your body, the consciousness that you now have, it could be applied to some other kind of body, but the one that is being applied to the other body was formed because it had your kind of body to begin with.
Yeah, if I understood that right, not sure if I did understand that right. So I think an analogous case might just be kind of first-person shooter games or other kinds of video game where I can begin to inhabit a world in which I've got eyes in the back of my head, literally. I'm getting information from behind me.
Right.
That's fairly easy to get on top of that sort of information. Just so I think we could get used to having 8 virtual arms or 8 real arms in some distant robotic platform.
Yeah, the point being, though, that the mentality starting that was formed in your kind of body now.
Exactly. Okay, so that is true of me now.
Yeah.
What will be true of humans in the future, I don't know. But certainly, yeah. So embodiment is always the starting point, and I think some kind of embodiment is always essential. It's just that there may be a bit more open-endedness in the form of the embodiment itself than some embodied theorists think.
So I would be a non-deflationist in terms of the hard problem, and I would say that embodied cognition is an important contribution to our understanding of the enrichment of what we mean by consciousness and what the experiences and the qualia that we feel are very much shaped by the bodily experiences that we have. But fundamentally, the fact that there are qualia, there are things that it feels like to see and be and think, is so radically different from anything we know of the physical world that it demands further explanation. But you don't agree with that?
I agree that it demands further explanation. I think the explanation it demands is understanding how matter, when it's organized in certain ways, gives rise to creatures that will make certain kinds of response and say and do certain kinds of thing. I think once you've cracked all of those problems, then you've solved the problem. It would be very weird, I think, to understand enough about the structure of the mind to be able to build robots that behaved like human beings pretty well, expressed puzzlement about some of their qualia, wondered whether their qualia were the same as our qualia, and then turn around and say, yeah, but I don't really know whether you've got consciousness or not because there was that explanatory gap and I'm just not sure if you've crossed it.
You're using words like response, as opposed to the impossibility of having direct first-person knowledge of that of the first-person experience, which we can never have a meter that can determine that.
Yeah.
And so you wash that away a bit, saying if we can't know it, then if something says and acts and responds that way, it must be that way.
In a way, I mean, I guess I think that it becomes conceptually incoherent to defend the sort of zombie intuition, the intuition that there could be a creature that just, in every possible probe, passes the probes for being a conscious creature, and yet nonetheless isn't conscious. To me, that is just a kind of sort of unscientific viewpoint to take. Once you once you've sort of produced all of the patterns in behavior that we use to judge whether something is conscious, including myself, I judge that I'm conscious, I think, in part because of all the things I see myself saying and doing.
And therefore, the embodiment of cognition, which is critical for the mind itself, is an important pillar in your building a deflationary case for consciousness.
I think that's right. It certainly can be a pillar for that sort of endeavour. So the idea would be that we can tell stories about the importance of understanding other agents for social interactions and the way in which that sort of knowledge could be reapplied to ourselves, stories about interoception that give us a thick mattering kind of take on the world. And once you tell a few stories like that, maybe one more about language and super heavy-duty self-awareness, I think we've covered all the bases. We've explained everything that there is that's worth explaining about consciousness.